People in Dubai, they come here to typically to work. It's not really somewhere you come to retire to. It's somewhere you come to work and do stuff in. So you end up with people who have a bit of time on the weekend, but not that much time. They've got kids, they've got other activities as well. So we built a second education system called the Local Heroes course. And this is destined for busy people that live in the country. They can do a lot of the theoretical studies online. So we built an online set of courses. And that teaches them everything from broad knowledge about the oceans, oceanology type stuff, all the way down through different ecosystems to the coral part and digging into that a little bit more. And then we follow that up with a couple of days of in-water training where we teach people how to do all the things that I was mentioning before. So, how to collect corals, which kind of corals, how to detect disease, because we obviously don't want to bring diseased corals into the environment, how to transplant, how to do propagation, etc., etc.
Hi everyone, welcome to Now Boarding, a new travel podcast by me, Payal Nair. This show aims at creating awareness about ecotourism, sustainable tourism, responsible travel, and a lot more. We will cover stories and journeys of people who are ecotourism specialists and those who are leaders in their field. We will also be talking to people who have had unique travel experiences, remarkable conceptual places to stay, unexplored cultures, and ancient histories of various towns and cities around the world. Join me in this journey of knowing more about travel. Get inspired to see the world and discover your inner self. Hi everyone. Today I am in conversation with Darryl Owen. Darryl is the owner and founder of Freestyle Divers in the Middle East, with the intention of building a different kind of diving experience for the customers. And it's interesting that Darryl he says, I'm going to ask him to repeat what he says after the introduction, but both of us are in Dubai at the same time. But he's actually not in Dubai. Hi, Darryl. Thank you for joining me today. And before we start the conversation, can you remind me again as to where exactly you are in the middle of the ocean somewhere? As you mentioned to me earlier, I think my listeners would be interested in hearing where you are exactly and what the term actually signifies or implies.
I'm actually sitting on one of what they call the World Islands, which is just off the coast of Dubai. So it's a little boat ride from Dubai. And it was a series of islands that were constructed a few years back, quite a few years back now, probably, 10 years or something. And the idea was that they'd create islands in the shape of countries, so that if you looked at it from space, then it looks like a sort of map of the world, but actually as islands in the ocean. So I'm currently sitting in a hotel room in the middle of the Europe area.
Middle of Europe area.
Absolutely. And it's hilarious because just outside my hotel window, and this can only be in Dubai, they've basically constructed a rain machine so that the street which my window is on, it rains every 15 minutes because it's Europe. And so it rains.
Oh my God, that is so fascinating.
There we are. So if you suddenly hear a delusion downpour outside in the middle of Dubai, it's not a real one, unfortunately.
It's simulated.
Exactly.
Okay, so Darryl, thank you for that. And let's kickstart the conversation with you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in diving and in marine conservation.
Okay. Diving's a long story for me. I started diving it must be nearly 37 or 38 years ago now. I learned in the UK in 6-degree black waters, freezing cold, couldn't see anything, but for some bizarre reason, I loved it. And I've carried on all these years, and I even met my wife, part of diving as well. And so we ended up here in Dubai because I was also in software and consulting and stuff like that for most of my career. And I came here to open up a bunch of offices for an American company and an analytics company. So I ended up opening offices in Dubai, Moscow, Johannesburg, Mumbai, Istanbul, and a few more. And it was actually quite funny because my wife was pregnant when we first arrived. And so after baby arrived in Dubai and my wife was feeling a bit better, she said, it's time to go diving again. And she said, you know what? We've got sea everywhere here. Why don't we go and get a boat? And so I went on to our local website called Dubizzle, which is like an eBay type thing, but local. And I found a boat. And so I went out to chat to the chap and came back in the evening. And my wife said, so have we got a boat? And I said, actually, no, we've got two and a dive center. Now, there are very few wives in the world who actually go, yay, that's fantastic. Mine did. And that was the start of Freestyle Divers 9 years ago, at least our part of it. And we then enjoyed that for a few years. And about 5, nearly 6 years ago, we had some issues with the coral reefs in our sort of diving neighborhood, as it were, bleaching, and they were just looking very sorry for themselves. We had a very hot summer that year, and the sea temperatures didn't do the corals any favor at all. And so I decided that it would be a great idea for us as accomplished divers and project managers in sort of real life outside diving. Why don't we start up a project that is actually going to look at how we protect, save, extend these reef systems, because they're beautiful. And it would be such a shame if my grandchildren didn't get to see similar sorts of things in their lifetime. I recruited a couple of marine biologists, a couple of young people, very enthusiastic, and we started putting together our ideas and testing out a few things under the water. And a couple of years later, I applied for an official government permit and also brought in some more experienced and mature marine biologist types who had experience in Thailand and South Africa of doing similar types of things. And it was at that point we started our phase 1 project. And basically, to make it simple, what we do is go out and collect naturally broken fragments of coral, mainly the branching corals, the ones that look like trees, not the ones that look like brains. And so we collect fragments, basically rescue them from the seafloor where they've been broken. And if they stay on the seafloor, they'll get covered by sand and sediment and stuff. And just if you basically buried a plant in the garden, it obviously wouldn't last long. It would die because it needs sunlight to photosynthesize. And it's the same with coral. And so we rescue those. We whisk them off in a crate underwater and then plant those coral fragments into nurseries. And you can think of this as being a bit like a greenhouse in the garden, where you're going to put small seedlings and stuff like that, and then basically nurture them until they're strong enough to go out and be planted. So we grow them the corals out to about 15 centimeters or so. And then we take them and plant them onto either damaged part of the natural reef, or we also plant them out onto artificial reefs. So to put a bit more context around that, the seascape here in the Middle East is very similar to the landscape in the sense that you're sitting in Dubai right now. It's a bustling metropolis, but if you traveled 20 kilometers, you'd find yourself in the desert.
Yeah.
And there's a vast tract of sand before the next city. And obviously not many people living there, not many creatures living there either, because it's pretty hot in the summer.
Yeah.
And it's the same under the sea. So we have these like rock pinnacles, little islands and stuff like that, where coral settles and then the fish come and live there as well. So it creates nice habitat for them, and that becomes a nursery for fish. But if you move 700-800 meters, you've got a vast tract of barren sand where nothing is going on apart from perhaps a few crabs on the floor and some worms in the sand and whatnot. And so we started looking at, well, how can we extend the natural reefs and create artificial reefs? Because coral needs something hard to settle on. It needs a hard and solid substrate. So we decided to build artificial reefs. And rather than just doing boring ones, we actually started to build sculptures. So we use rebar, the sort of metal bars you put inside concrete for construction.
Yeah.
So we use those, and we've got a very talented chap who runs our conservation project called James Campbell. And he's one of these rare people that can look at a pile of metal and imagine what a whale shark looks like, and then just bend all these pieces of metal into the right shapes, weld them together, and it looks absolutely amazing. So we do this. And then we put them in the sea, and then we plant all these sort of 15 centimeter corals onto those structures. And the whole idea is that they won't last forever. These metal structures over time will obviously become more fragile with the seawater. They will rust through at a certain point. And obviously the coral that we put on top of it is going to grow. So it might start at 15 centimeters, but when it's finished, it might be a meter or a meter and a half across and quite heavy. And also quite thick at that point. You know, we're estimating probably 10, 12, 13 years, something like that. But at that point, it will collapse, but the coral will be large enough to actually land on the sand and not be covered by sediment and sand. So now we've just created a new natural reef. So that's the sort of long and short of it.
So what are some of the unique marine species that you have been able to discover underwater around where you are, which you think is fascinating and something that, you know, you weren't really expecting, other than, of course, the corals that we've talked about, or you've talked about, but some other species that, you know, that you've so uncovered and discovered as you've gone along?
The most interesting part of this for us, obviously the coral part is interesting, but coral's what they call, or what we call, an ecosystem architect. It normally grows in waters that are very clear and without nutrients, without food in it. So it's usually crystal clear waters. And coral's a very interesting combination. It's basically a symbiosis between coral, the animal, and something called zooxanthellae, which is an algae that settles inside the coral. Okay, and that's what gives coral its color. So when you see these beautiful red and green and sort of blue corals and stuff, it's actually the algae that makes it that color. Now, it's able to produce its own food. So you've got the algae that's photosynthesizing and creating energy and sugars and stuff. The animal is partly feeding on that and partly feeding itself with its little tentacles and stuff out in the water. But it's able to feed itself. And then what happens is an ecosystem starts to build itself around the coral, which is why we call it an ecosystem architect, because imagine it was a city. This is basically a construction company coming in and building hundreds of apartments and a supermarket and a couple of cinemas and whatever, a coral version of.
Yeah.
And once you've done that, as long as there's food and there's work, people come along and start living in the city. And that's exactly what happens with coral reefs. So one of the biggest interest points for us was, how long is it going to take for us to populate our new reef? Because we deliberately chose not to put it close to a natural reef. It was 800, a bit more than 800 meters off of the natural reef in bare and barren sand with nothing around, apart from like a crab or a worm or three. Part of the project was actually recording the speed at which the different species arrived. And so we actually created a list of all of the different species and the order they arrived and how long it took. And the first ones to arrive are typically the herbivores. So the corals will grow and then algae will start to settle in. And obviously that provides a food source, just like on land, plants are the sort of bottom of the food chain, same in the ocean. And so we ended up with a bunch of little fish coming along who like to nibble on the leaves. Then, of course, you get bigger fish that like to nibble on the smaller fish that start to arrive. And then we get even bigger fish that start to nibble on the middle-sized fish, and so on and so forth. So you start creating this food pyramid. So we ended up, in the first 9 months, we ended up with more than 100 species that were recruited. And that's individual species, of which each species demonstrated numbers. Some of them were shoals of fish and some of them were individuals. We had some baby turtles that decided to come and use our place as a snack bar, which was really laying on our nursery tables, using the coral to scratch their tummies and then nibbling on the algae between the corals. It was lovely on a photograph, but not very helpful towards our scientific project. We had to reposition all the corals afterwards because they'd all fallen over. We ended up with rays. We ended up with all sorts of cuttlefish. We ended up with frogfish, which in our waters are extremely rare. I think I'd seen 2 in 10 years before that. And we ended up with 3 of them settling on our reef. Different species as well. Yeah, we ended up with quite the ecosystem at the end, and we've documented all of that photographically and with video. And we've created a local taxonomy so that we can do the same thing on our second site and basically tick off the species as they come, recording how long they took each time. And one of the things that we're going to do as part of our phase 2 project, the one we're working on now, is to create separate sites that we link together. And what we're trying to prove is that if we create a site in the middle of the sand, and then 300 or 400 meters away, we create another site, we populate the first site, and then we create a pathway. And we're intending to use what we call gabion bags, which are essentially wire mesh bags filled with oyster shells from our local oyster farm. They have a lot of waste shells, and this is a great circular economy way of putting them back into use very helpfully. So we'll build this little highway between the different sites and test whether it accelerates recruitment. Because if we've got 100 species on one site and they all end up on the second site, but in half the time that the first site arrived, that is then going to validate our approach for phase 3 for building that barrier reef down the coast. Because essentially what we'll do is just find all those little patch reefs, which are the tips of that buried reef, and then we'll glue them back together again with our highways, and then put some touristy sort of sites with sculptures and stuff along that way as well. So I don't know if that is randomly mentioned a few species there, but didn't perfectly answer your question.
Sort of how they've appeared is quite interesting. And I think it's plausible for you to be able to get all of it connected. So I think that's very interesting. So is there any kind of outreach in terms of engaging people or the next generation to be interested and wanting to get involved in this kind of conservation?
100%. So there are 2 pillars to what we do in terms of impact. So one of them is we're obviously very hands-on in the ocean, doing stuff to recreate ecosystems. The second pillar is education. So one of the very few benefits that we got out of lockdown was that we were all shut indoors. And so we built a complete education system, which is university level, focused around tropical ecosystems. So we built that first, and the original idea was as soon as everyone could travel again, it would offer an opportunity for the students that find themselves in colder countries. A couple of us come from the UK. There are a lot of universities in the UK that do marine biology and stuff, and it's actually a requirement for those students to spend 2, 3, 4 months working outside in situ in tropical environments. So we built a course for them, or several courses. And then we started looking at it and saying, okay, what are we going to do for the people here? Because people in Dubai, they come here typically to work. It's not really somewhere you come to retire to. It's somewhere you come to work and do stuff in. So you end up with people who have a bit of time on the weekend, but not that much time. They've got kids, they've got other activities as well. So we built a second education system called the Local Heroes course. And this is destined for busy people that live in the country. They can do a lot of the theoretical studies online. So we built an online set of courses. And that teaches them everything from broad knowledge about the oceans, oceanology type stuff, all the way down through different ecosystems to the coral part and digging into that a little bit more. And then we follow that up with a couple of days of in-water training where we teach people how to do all the things that I was mentioning before. So, how to collect corals, which kind of corals, how to detect disease, because we obviously don't want to bring diseased corals into the environment, how to transplant, how to do propagation, etc., etc. So after a couple of days, they've got all the basic knowledge they need to join our team. And then we have a team called the Reef Rescue Team within Project Reframe, which is actually the name of the overall project. That may have taken a glass of something slightly stronger than tea to come up with. It was Reef and then Frame, so but with one F. So basically, we're building reefs out of frames. I thought that was quite good. And we're reframing the way that people look at the ocean as well. So out of a bottle, to be honest. But anyway. Um, so we put this local heroes course together. That's more oriented towards young adults to people of any age. I think the oldest person we have working with us is just over 70, I think, still getting in the water and stuff. And then we started looking at the kids because we've got a lot of divers who've got families, and the kids are getting very interested in all of the green stuff here in the UAE as well. The educational authorities pushing on that very hard around the COP28 thing as well.
Yeah.
And so we built the Ocean Explorers course, and that's for 6 years old plus. And basically, we get our little cherubs to come along. We give them an hour and a half in the classroom, teaching them all about different species, explaining them to them what all the parts are called of fish and things like that. So there's a little bit of theory around that. And then we go out and take some nets and we collect plankton out of the sea with them, bring them back. And when we look at them under microscopes, so they can see all these, we put it up on a telly with nice imagery, so they can see all these little funky little things swimming around. And we help to name all of those things with them. Then we take them out either snorkeling or diving, depending on the age. If they're 10 plus, we can take them diving. If they're less, than snorkeling. And we show them all the things that they learned about during their classroom session, actually underwater on the reef. Then they come back and they paint their experience onto ceramic tiles, which we then fire in an oven and take back out to place their signature onto the artificial reefs for eternity.
Thank you so much, Darryl. I've really enjoyed listening to you, and I've learned a lot in whatever the past 30 minutes or 40 minutes that we've been talking. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I hope
very welcome.
And goes off well. You're in the middle of, you say that particular island is like Europe.
It's raining again.
It's raining
again.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of Now Boarding, a travel podcast. Check out other episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. And of course, don't forget to share your thoughts with us. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes only on Now Boarding, a travel podcast.